Good morning, Elder Williams. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank the Canadian Water Network for the opportunity to be here. I'd like to tell you just a bit of the story of the Northwest Territories, of the Mackenzie River Basin, of integrated watershed management and politics. And I'd just like to make a comment first. The various responsibilities that I do have, to me, are a perfect mix. I have access and have the chair that controls the money. I have responsibilities for a power corporation, which gives me the ability to move ahead on things like solar power and biomass and wind power, alternative energy, all the other good things. And then I have the environment, natural resources, which lets me put into play and address a lot of the needs of the people of the Northwest Territories. So when you look at the Mackenzie River Basin, it's a huge basin, and there's a lot of political jurisdictions there. There's many Aboriginal governments. There's Alberta, Saskatchewan, BC, Yukon, Northwest Territories. And we are very interested, we the Northwest Territories, in what we call integrated watershed management. And there was an agreement signed back in 1997, the Mackenzie River Basin Transboundary Master Agreement, with the federal government, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Yukon, British Columbia, Northwest Territories, and representatives from Aboriginal representatives from those jurisdictions, where we committed ourselves to working together to practice integrated watershed management. And we were supposed to have bilateral agreements between each of the jurisdictions that would lay out that arrangement on an ongoing basis. That was signed in 1997. And what happened then is everything basically went silent. All the people went back about their business. Water was not really a huge issue. And it got put off to the side. It was the board that was there was populated by well-meaning civil servants from the various jurisdictions, but with no real political mandate or attention being paid to the issue of water. So at the political level, the issue of water was quiet. However, there was significant and growing concern across the land about water, not only in Canada, but in the Northwest Territories. And as we talk about the circuit that's out there with water conferences and the growing concern at the local level, at the territorial level, provincial, national, international level, it didn't stop. So, but still the sad reality, or the reality is, I've been doing this now for about 7 years, and I tend to still be the only politician in the room. Doesn't matter if it's here in Ottawa. I was down in Buenos Aires. I've been just about in every province in the country talking about water. And there's rooms filled with very concerned people, but a dearth of politicians. And as you'll talk about later today, the research, the practice are all well and good, but doing the science and research is not enough. You do have to have that political connection. And we need you and you need us, because unless we work together, the things we all need to do won't get done. In the Northwest Territories, on a political note, there's 3 territories. One already has all the political autonomy they're going to get between them and provincehood, which is the Yukon Territory. About 10 years ago, they signed an agreement with the federal government that gave them final control over land, water, and resource development. The Northwest Territories has been pushing for that since at least 1967. There's been 17 assemblies in the Northwest Territories since its creation, and every one of those has been pushing towards self-government, responsible political development and evolution. And we just last week signed an initial agreement in Yellowknife. Prime Minister Harper came up, and we initialed the deal for our own devolution agreement. While not perfect, is far better than what we currently have in terms of taking off the final shackles from the federal government that bind us and limit our ability to manage land, water, and resource development. That leaves only the Nunavut Territory to conclude their own agreement. Back in 1967, the planes came north out of Yellowknife, one or two, because most of the people that were looking after the Northwest Territories in Ottawa didn't want to move. And I was 16 at the time. Now I'm standing here in 2013. I'm 62, 46 years pretty well, that we've been on this journey in my lifetime that I can remember. And it is a long time coming. And most of you folks here, probably just an academic abstract idea, not having control over the land, the water, and the resources that are in your territory or in your province. You all grow up taking it for granted. And if I asked any one of you what would happen in your jurisdiction, Alberta, Ontario, Quebec, Manitoba, if you were told that the federal government was going to make all the decisions, they're going to control all the processes that govern the land and the water and how your particular territory is going to develop, I think you'd look at me like you wouldn't even be able to, I don't think, comprehend the frustration and aggravation and the desire we have as Northerners, very similar to what the Aboriginal governments have in the Northwest Territories for their own self-government and the need to control things that are critically important to them. So in the Northwest Territories, when you look at it, it's a big place, 1.4 million square kilometers. It has 11 official languages. There's 7 main Aboriginal governments that we're doing business with that are critically involved in the work we're doing on water. We have the Nuvialawit, Gwich'in, Saulteaux, Kletcho, Decho, Quechua, and the Northwest Territories Métis. And we have been working since 2007, 2008, after we passed the motion where we said water was a fundamental human right and access to water was a fundamental human right. We started developing a water strategy in partnership with the Aboriginal governments, where we, every step of the way, with this Aboriginal Steering Committee, we developed a water strategy that laid out the key elements that we thought and know were essential to the Northwest Territories being able to move ahead. We were planning for the day when devolution would come, that we need to have our thinking clear about what we were going to do with water. We had to reassure the people of the North, the Aboriginal governments, that we understood and appreciated, and we're going to do the things necessary as a government to manage and work with the Aboriginal governments as it pertains to the land and the water. And for us, this is not a business issue. This is not water as a commodity. This is water as the fundamental piece, the foundation for all of us. In the Aboriginal governments, it's built into their treaties, it's built into their land claim agreements. And for Northerners, while we sometimes take it for granted, we're the ultimate downstream jurisdiction, and we have some of the biggest lakes and rivers in the world in the Northwest Territories. So it was critical that we work together to develop the water strategy. And we have done that in partnership. And there's 2 main focuses of the water strategy. The water strategy is focused on how we manage ourselves in the Northwest Territories. And we've struck partnerships with Canadian Water Network, with Wilfrid Laurier, because like everybody else, we struggle for resources, but things like community-based water monitoring, being able to reassure the people in the Northwest Territories that the water that they have come to take for granted sometimes, but are very concerned about, is in fact meets all the tests for being good to drink and not having a lot of these very rare and exotic chemicals and heavy metals and such in it that are coming to us from all over the world, from south of us in Alberta, dams in BC, things that are coming out of the air, naphthenic acids, polycyclic aromatic, hydrocarbons, heavy metals, bitumens, all the things that are making their way north. And the people are very, very concerned about that. So we've focused on community-based water monitoring across the Northwest Territories from the 60th parallel up to the Arctic Ocean. At the same time, we are actively negotiating with Alberta to pick up back to the Mackenzie River Basin Transboundary Master Agreement. We've picked up the challenge to get the bilateral agreements done. Thinking has changed dramatically since 1997. In 1997, there was one agreement done between the Yukon and the Northwest Territories, and it was a very general, porous, feel-good, non-binding, not particularly helpful agreement. Today, we've put together one of the best, in my mind, water negotiating teams in the country, and we're negotiating with Alberta, which is our biggest neighbor directly south of us, and we started considerably apart in our points of view. There's a 60th parallel that is a very significant political boundary there. In Alberta, which has been and has been for decades a strong conservative riding, and in the Northwest Territories, we switch back and forth mainly between the NDP and Liberal. We have significant Aboriginal government representation at our tables. They're the biggest landowners next to government. 50% of the population is Aboriginal. And the issue for us is taking care of the land, the water, and the animals, and balancing that with the pressures for resource development. But we have to take care of the land, the water, and the animals first, because if you don't do that, and the people tell us this, the Aboriginal governments insist on it, then the rest is a moot point. Nothing will work if that balance is out of kilter. So we've been working very hard with Alberta, and we've come very close, and we are very close to an agreement. And there is a recognition in both jurisdictions, and I think BC and Saskatchewan as well, that before you talk about people, before you talk about business, before you talk about agriculture, you have to decide how much water does the land need to survive and the environment needs to survive. And that number for us is in the high 90% of what's flowing through the Mackenzie River Basin has first and foremost goes to the land, and to protect the ecosystems and all the things that makes life possible in our world and in your world, that if we forget that piece, the rest is moot. So we are, as we speak, in fact, there's negotiations going on today with Alberta. We anticipate a couple of big political events here in the next few months. We're going to sign the final agreement for devolution, which will be long overdue, and shortly thereafter, we're going to sign an agreement with Alberta on a legally binding bilateral transboundary water agreement. And then months after that, we're going to conclude another one with BC, another one with Saskatchewan, and then we're going to redo the one with the Yukon, so that in the next year, we're going to be able to have the Mackenzie River Basin and that agreement functioning the way it was designed to allow us to talk about, in a meaningful way, integrated watershed management, what that means. And it's not an easy task, because there are different political points of view, there's different ideologies, there's different perceptions of how important is water and what does integrated watershed management mean. How do you do it in a way that doesn't impede and infringe upon the sovereign rights of the various provinces and territories? But when you have a common goal and a common reason to do this, which is we are all inhabitants of the Mackenzie River Basin, that it's in all our interests to sort this out, because if we don't, then all the problems that we see in other places around the world are going to come and visit themselves upon us, because we are as well struggling with climate change. We have some of the worst environmental sites in the country, in Canada, in the Northwest Territories, remnants from a different time and a different age, mines where we have almost 300,000 tons of arsenic trioxide stuck in mine shafts below and right on the shore of Great Slave Lake, for example, that we know that we have to do things differently and better. And our commitment and our collective goal between ourselves, the public government, and the territorial and the Aboriginal governments is to, in fact, do those things so that we can, in fact, keep that balance. And as we look towards the future and we sort ourselves out, we have to deal with some very, very tough issues, not only the negotiations. I was talking to a gentleman from Pennsylvania, and the amount of fracking going on in his neighborhood. We are now, for example, having to sort that out in the central Mackenzie, where we have a big oil play underway, and nobody knows exactly what that could mean to us. We have gaps in groundwater knowledge, our gaps even in our surface water, wildlife issues. We need all that baseline information, but we have to come to grips with that. as we balance the need for an economy that's going to allow people to have jobs and be able to be net contributors to Canada, but at the same time protecting the integrity of the water basin so that water remains substantially unaltered, as is laid out in land claims and treaties, and is the central piece of the water strategy. So our story is that goal, the political goal, going back decades to manage ourselves, having our thinking clear, and the recognition that while it's taken a lot of time and the deal that we're going to sign on devolution is not perfect, it's far better than where we are today. And as we look to the future, we know that we're going to have a lot of ongoing discussions with all Canadians. And as I end every brief presentation I make, what you see in the Mackenzie River Basin and what you see in that map that was laid out earlier with the few red dots, there's a large part of the country that there's no dots, which gets to the issue of a national water strategy, that sooner or later we are going to, as a country, come to the recognition that we do need a national water strategy, that you look at the Mackenzie River Basin, you look at all the other waters that flow from there, around there, we're cheek to jowl with Hudson Bay, the huge challenges in Manitoba, what's happening with Lake Winnipeg, the Great Lakes. They're all related, they're all linked, and we cannot continue to look at them in isolation. And there is a role for the federal government, a careful role, but there is a role. You can't look at water, of course, separate from energy in our country, so those two are very key national initiatives that need to be carried out at some day soon if we're going to actually have the right conversation and do the right kind of planning. Thank you.